Hello, world. Today, we are going to do part two of the criticism, I guess, of the video that was made by Christian Watson. And it is his video that is called The Environmentalist Cult Must Be Stopped. Um, so, we are going to start our second part of that today, and that's Brother Kyle.
And that is Brother Cody. And to get us started on part two, I will pick up where we left off at the timestamp around 7 minutes. And the last point I actually made was him talking about, sort of the philosophical nature of like premeditated actions and all that stuff. And you sort of pointed out that he sort of always puts philosophy above science.
Yeah.
And, that's unfortunate. But to get us started, I'll just pick up there on that timestamp of the video. Once again, by Christian Watson, the environmentalist cult must be stopped, exposing its origin. So we're going to start around this timestamp for part two.
Every action undertaken in this world is first initiated by an idea. My idea behind coming towards all of you and speaking on this movement is initiated by my desire to help you all understand just how cynical and just how foul and just how incorrect the premises of the environmentalist movement are. Similarly, there are ideas that motivate people to go out in the streets and glue their hands to the streets and try to stop oil and all kind of stuff and push for ESG and push for the elimination of gasoline cars and push for the elimination of natural gas and all those. There's ideas behind it, and we have to understand those ideas before we can actually truly get to the bottom of what we are seeing. So let's actually explore this a little bit more. The foundations of modern day environmentalism are represented by two factions from my research, two factions. One of these factions says that.
So, yeah, the idea that the modern environmentalist movement can just be broken into two main factions is an oversimplification at best. And really, at this point, he's kind of just unnecessarily convoluting the conversation. There really is no reason to point out this factionalism when he is trying to illustrate what are foundational principles. Ultimately, he doesn't even explain why this factionalism is actually relevant.
Yeah. And so the comments that I have to make actually make a little more sense when we allow him to explain what those two factions are. And so that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. And then I'm going to chime in on how I feel about that.
Okay.
That the reason there's ecological crisis, there's an environmental crisis, there is deforestation, there is mass pollution, there's all these things, there's greenhouse gases, melting the ice caps. The reason all of these things are happening is because we don't have the right values. This faction, let's call them faction A, of the environmentalist movement says that the bad environmental outcomes happening in the West right now are entirely due to us having the wrong ideas surrounding the environment, not merely carelessness, not merely meaningless behavior, but it's us having the wrong ideas surrounding the environment. Now, there's another faction that says this focus on ideas is a little bit too weird, and the true culprit is our current economic environment. This faction more so points to capitalism as the culprit of the current ecological crisis that supposedly exists and will cause chaos and destruction, all kind of stuff. Now, many of you may say, well, this sounds like Marxism. Yes and no. So it's true. There are things called eco-Marxists. There are environmentalists who are actually Marxist and whose critiques center on capitalism. But even within the roots and the foundational factions of environmentalism, there's actually a tension between the Marxist and the non-Marxist. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But we shouldn't assume that just because an environmentalist critiques capitalism, and really when they critique capitalism, they're not really critiquing capitalism, they are critiquing what they see as the idea, the cult of material progress. What does that mean? Well, this cult of material progress says that society progresses and man progresses on the basis of sort of material accumulation of wealth, all that kind of thing, which according to environmentalists is not how things actually happen. In fact, David Pepper, who wrote a book that I'm citing heavily in this video called The Roots of Modern Environmentalism, says that environmentalists tend to believe that within the framework of the roots of the environmentalist movement, they tend to believe that the kind of society that is ecologically feasible and stable and therefore socially desirable, I'm quoting him, is where social progress is not measurable by material terms, but is instead measurable by social justice and spiritual progression. You're going to see this kind of abstract phrase used here a lot in this video, the sort of spiritual progression, social justice. That's the general sentiment. Whereas those who critique capitalism are saying that capitalism is a force for materialism, and materialism views the environment in a certain way that makes it so the environment is being exploited and not actually cared for, and therefore that's the source of our woes. Again, two different factions.
So yeah, those are the two different factions, and just to reiterate, it's really just an oversimplification to say that these two factions within the environmentalist movement make up the majority of the movement.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have in my notes, and it's a little further, but I'll just get out of the way anyways, is Christian does a good job in this video of going through different resources and actually looking at, what was said in these, books and texts and things like that. But is, as you called it, an oversimplification of the environmentalist movement. Yeah, I would agree with that, especially because, so we can start with the first one, and the first one is what he called like the bad values faction, and like he said it was weird, but it's like abstract and vague, and so like I don't really understand it, except for like what I think I do understand about it is that and maybe I'm strawmanning him a little bit here by saying Western values instead of just values, but he talks about it being the values of society that are the detriment or causing these detriments to the environment, which is another area where he started to gish gallops. So did that was fun, and so anyways, that's the first faction, and faction two is the what he called the eco-Marxists. And so the eco-Marxists is the people who think that capitalism is responsible for what our environment's going through, and I squarely fall into this bunch as well, because something that I do have written in my notes is that 70% of emissions come from 100 different companies. Now, the average American's carbon footprint is what you're told to be concerned about, but really it does not matter. I promise you it doesn't. What matters is these 100 companies. And are these 100 companies Marxist ideologically driven companies? No, they're not.
Yeah. Marxist corporation.
Yeah, it's all capitalism, and so capitalism is kind of like and so I actually was thinking about if he were to be challenged, or if the term Western values was to be challenged. So I would think like monotheism, capitalism, free markets, democracy, things like that, right? Like those sound like Western values, right?
Yeah.
Right. So like those things.
Yep.
Because he does talk about Christianity being involved too. So yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna keep going.
Yeah.
Aim, and the aim is ultimately to change how we see our relationship with the environment, because both of them come down to both things. The environmentalist movement, the claim is that people don't see nature in the correct way. Now, I must go to the foundational text, in my opinion, of modern day environmentalism, which was written in 1970s. And by the way, in the 1970s, there was a bunch of things relating to environmentalism coming out. You had the Club for Growth, the Club of Rome, which put out a pamphlet called Limits to Growth, which basically predicted doom and gloom if we didn't actually catch up and deal with the ecological crisis. And it was the same kind of thing that we're using too much resources, we're growing our population. And there were several other pamphlets and books and articles written in the 70s reflecting this theme of limited space, limited time, overpopulation, basically. And so during the 70s, that was a rich moment for the formation of the environmentalist movement. So this gentleman called Lynn White was a professor of history, wrote an article and delivered a talk as well to the American Association for the Advancement of Science called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And this is one of the weirdest, craziest, asinine articles I think of.
Yeah, so he doesn't even use like a conjunction, and this is another sort of example of how he like speed talks through certain points. He says, weirdest, craziest, asinine thing he's ever read. And it's like, I would literally say that about the video that I forced myself to watch here, because it really is one of the weirdest, craziest, most asinine things that I've forced myself to watch.
Yep, and we will talk about something later that makes me feel that way as well, and it comes back to this point, so that's really great. Real quick, I can see the timer, and also this is what I was going to say is let's go to your next timestamp and then talk about that, and then we'll do part 3.
Perfect.
Yeah, let's do that.
Never read my entire life. I'm going to quote a few excerpts from it. But in this article, I'll summarize. He basically says that the reason why there's so much environmental catastrophe is because man has become displaced from the land by the invention of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of tools that make it easier for him to work in reality. And also, before that, man's entire relationship in view of the environment, in view of nature, is no longer one of being a caretaker and a shepherd, or even a worshiper of the environment. It's one of being an exploiter. And he blames this man-nature relationship, which he twistedly says, on Christianity. He says that in the medieval times, there was this idea, the scientific revolution, brought forth by people like Francis Bacon, who was a famous scientist who helped invent a lot of things and helped contribute a lot to the intellectual history of science.
So this is a perfect place to end talking about Francis Bacon, because according to the textbook that I teach, a McGraw-Hill textbook, it says Francis Bacon is an English philosopher with few scientific credentials.
Right. And with that being said, we both know who he actually is. And that's not to say, he's not worthy of praise, because he was a pro-science guy. Well, like, we love that. He was a pioneer or whatever of the scientific method, and then empiricism as well. And so empiricism it's just data. That's what empiricism really is data research. So yeah, that's the kind of science that a lot of people find wildly boring, but I actually can find it interesting. So
yeah, so why don't you end us with the Francis Bacon quote that we tend to use?
Definitely. And we will be back for part 3 here shortly. And yeah, we should be able to get through in part 3. All right, cool. Remember, folks, knowledge is power.